Hello, students. It's time for our next read aloud. So we're reading Flora and Ulysses. When last we left our main character, Flora, she had started to perform CPR on a squirrel that had been sucked up by a vacuum. So let's see what happens next. Chapter 5, The Squirrel Obliges. See if we can figure out what obliges means. Something strange had happened to that squirrel's brain. Things had gone black. And then into this black blankness there came a light so beautiful, so bright, that the squirrel had to turn away. A voice spoke to him. "What's that?" said the squirrel. The light shone brighter. The voice spoke again. "Okay," said the squirrel, "you bet." He wasn't sure what exactly he was agreeing to, but it didn't matter. He was just so happy. He was floating in a great lake of light, and the voice was singing to him. Oh, it was wonderful. It was the best thing ever. And then there was a loud noise. The squirrel heard another voice. The voice was counting. The light receded. And then there was a loud noise. Oh wait, I already read that part, sorry. So the light receded. "Breathe," the new voice shouted. The squirrel obliged. He took a deep, shuddering breath. So someone told him to breathe, and then the narrator said the squirrel obliged, and then right after it said he took a deep, shuddering breath. So what might it mean to oblige when someone tells you something? He took a deep breath, and then another, and another. The squirrel returned. Chapter 6, In the Event of a Seizure. "Well, he's breathing," said Mrs. Tickum. "Yes," said Flora, "he is." She felt a swell of pride. The squirrel rolled over onto his stomach. He raised his head. His eyes were glazed. "For heaven's sake," said Mrs. Tickum, "look at him." She chuckled quietly. She shook her head, and then she laughed out loud. She kept laughing. She laughed and laughed and laughed. She laughed so hard she started to shake. Was she having some kind of fit? Flora tried to remember what terrible things can happen to you, advised in the event of a seizure. It had something to do with moving the tongue out of the way or stabilizing it with a stick or something. Flora had saved the squirrel's life. She didn't see any reason she couldn't save Miss Tickum's tongue. The sun sank a little lower in the sky. Mrs. Tickum continued to laugh, hysterically. And Flora Belle Buckman started looking around the Tickums' backyard for a stick. Chapter 7, The Soul of a Squirrel. The squirrel was a little unsteady on his feet. His brain felt larger, roomier. It was as if several doors in the dark room of his self, doors he hadn't even known existed, had suddenly been flung wide open. Everything was shot through with meaning and purpose and light. However, the squirrel was still a squirrel, and he was hungry. Very. All right, so remember how I told you this book is part graphic novel? So let's take a look at these pictures. So there's the squirrel. He's missing some of his hair. He's kind of sniffing around that vacuum. And up top here, it says, hang on, let me scoot it over a little bit. Up top it says, "Who can say what astonishments are hidden inside the most mundane being?" So let's think about that word mundane. Is a squirrel a unique and exciting and unusual animal, or do we think of it as kind of a regular animal? It's kind of regular. So a mundane animal would be a regular animal. But he's not so regular anymore. It looks like something's falling out of the vacuum. What do you suppose that is? Looks like he's happy about it. Well, if he's very hungry, I guess it could be something edible. All right, Chapter 8. Helpful information. Flora and Mrs. Tickum noticed at the same time. "The squirrel," said Flora. "The vacuum cleaner," said Mrs. Tickum. Together, they stared at the Ulysses 2000X and at the squirrel who was holding it over his head with one paw. "Well, that can't be," said Mrs. Tickum. The squirrel shook the vacuum cleaner. "That can't be," said Mrs. Tickum. "You already said that," said Flora. "I'm repeating myself?" "You're repeating yourself." "Oh, no, maybe I have a brain tumor," said Mrs. Tickum. It was certainly possible that Miss Tickum had a brain tumor. Flora knew from reading Terrible Things Can Happen to You that a surprising number of people were walking around with things they didn't even know about. That was the thing about tragedy. It was just sitting there, keeping you company, waiting. Man, Flora seems to enjoy reading and learning about unfortunate, sad things. She seems a little dark. This was the kind of helpful information you can get from comics, if you paid attention. The other kind of information that you absorbed from the regular reading of comics, most particularly from the regular reading of the illuminated adventures of the amazing Incandesto, was that impossible things happened all the time. You know, another thing I wonder how reliable this comic book is for, like, scientific information. For instance, heroes, superheroes, were born out of ridiculous and unlikely circumstances. Spider bites, chemical spills, planetary dislocation, and, in the case of Alfred T. Slipper, from accidental submersion into an industrial-sized vat of cleaning solution called Incandesto, the cleaning professional's hard-working friend. "I don't think you have a brain tumor," said Flora. "There's got to be another explanation." "Uh-huh," said Mrs. Tickum. "Well, what's the other explanation?" "Have you ever heard of Incandesto?" "What?" said Mrs. Tickum. "Who?" said Flora. "Incandesto is a who? He's a superhero." "Right," said Mrs. Tickum. "And your point is?" Flora raised her right hand. She pointed a single finger down at the squirrel. "Surely you're not implying," said Mrs. Tickum. The squirrel lowered the vacuum cleaner to the ground. He held himself very still. He considered both of them. His whiskers twitched and trembled. There were cracker crumbs on his head. He was a squirrel. Could he be a superhero too? Alfred T. Slipper was a janitor. Most of the time people looked right past him. Sometimes, often in fact, they treated him with disdain. They had no idea of the astonishing acts of heroism, the blinding light contained within his outward, humdrum disguise. Only Alfred's parakeet, Dolores, knew who he was and what he could do. "The world will misunderstand him," said Flora. "You bet it will," said Mrs. Tickum. "Tootie!" shouted Mr. Tickum from the back door. "Tootie, I'm hungry!" You know, she just got pulled outside by a vacuum. You'd think he could wait for his dinner for a little while. Tootie, Flora thought. What a ridiculous name. Flora couldn't resist the urge to say it out loud. "Tootie," she said. "Tootie Tickum. Listen, Tootie. Go inside. Feed your husband. Say nothing to him or anyone else about this." "Right," said Tootie. "Say nothing. Feed my husband. Okay, right." She began walking slowly toward the house. Mr. Tickum called out, "Are you done vacuuming? What about the Ulysses? Are you just going to leave it out there?" "Ulysses," whispered Flora. She felt a shiver run down from the back of her head to the base of her spine. She might be a natural-born cynic, but she knew the right word when she heard it. Ulysses. She said it out loud again. "Come here, Ulysses," she said. Chapter 9. The Whole World on Fire. She spoke to him, and he understood her. What the girl said was, "Ulysses, come here, Ulysses." And without thinking, he moved toward her. "It's okay," she said, and he believed her. It was astonishing. Everything was astonishing. The setting sun was illuminating each blade of grass. It was reflecting off the girl's glasses, making a halo of light around the girl's round head, setting the whole world on fire. The squirrel thought, when did things become so beautiful? And if it had been this way all along, how is it I never noticed before? "Listen to me," the girl said. "My name is Flora. Your name is Ulysses." "Okay," thought the squirrel. She put her hand on him. She picked him up, and she cradled him in her left arm. He felt nothing but happiness. Why had he always been so terrified of humans? He couldn't imagine now. Actually, he could imagine. I love that picture. It's so sweet. There had been a time with a boy and a BB gun. There had been lots of incidents with humans, some involving BB guns, some not, and all of them had been violent, terrifying, soul-destroying. But this was a new life, and he was a changed squirrel. He felt spectacular, strong, smart, capable, and also hungry. He was very, very hungry. Chapter 10. Squirrel Smuggling. Flora's mother was in the kitchen. She was typing. She wrote on an old typewriter, and when she pounded the keys, the kitchen table shook, and the plates on the shelves rattled, and the silverware in the drawers cried out like a metallic alarm. Flora had decided that this was part of the reason her parents were divorced. Not just the noise of the writing, but the writing itself. Specifically, the writing of romance. Flora's father had said, "I think your mother is so in love with her books about love that she doesn't love me." And her mother had said, "Your father is so far off in left field that he wouldn't recognize love if it stood up in his soup and sang." So they don't get along. Flora had a hard time imagining what love would be doing standing in a bowl of soup anyway, but these were the kind of idiotic words her parents spoke. And they said these words to each other, even though they were pretending to say them to Flora. It was all very annoying. "What are you doing?" her mother said to Flora. She was sucking on a Pitzer Pop. It made her words sound rocky and sharp-edged. So have you ever listened to somebody talking with a sucker in their mouth and it clacks against their teeth while they're talking? It's kind of what the author's trying to describe here. Her mother used to smoke, and then she stopped. But she still had to have something in her mouth when she was typing, so she ate a lot of Pitzer Pops. This one was orange flavored. Flora could smell it. "Oh, nothing," said Flora. She glanced at the squirrel in her arms. "Good," said her mother. She whacked the carriage to return on her typewriter without looking up. She kept typing. "Are you still standing there?" her mother said. She typed more words. She hit the carriage return again. "I'm on a deadline here. It's hard to concentrate when you're standing behind me breathing like that." "I could stop breathing," said Flora. "Oh, don't be ridiculous," said her mother. "Go upstairs and wash your hands. We're going to eat soon." "Okay," said Flora. She walked past her mother and into the living room. She was still carrying Ulysses in the crook of her arm. It didn't seem possible, but it was true. She had smuggled a squirrel into the house. She had done it right under her mother's nose, or behind her back, or something. In the living room, at the base of the stairs, the little shepherdess lamp was waiting, a pink-cheeked smirk plastered on her face. So I'm going to show you the picture now, even though the page isn't over. So here's Flora's mom. Looks like she's really trying to focus. And then we've got Flora. And then in the back here is the lamp. So if you've ever seen Toy Story, and Bo Peep, it's kind of like one of those kind of lamps that she used to be a part of, but much bigger. That's the shepherdess lamp. Flora hated the little shepherdess. Her mother had bought the lamp with her first royalty check from her very first book, On Feathered Wings of Joy, which was the dumbest title for a book Flora had ever heard in her life. Her mother had sent away to London for the lamp. When it arrived, she unpacked it and plugged it in, and she clapped her hands and said, "Oh, she's beautiful! Isn't she beautiful? I love it with all my heart." Flora's mother never called Flora beautiful. She never said she loved her with all her heart. Luckily, Flora was a cynic and didn't care whether her mother loved her or not. "I'll call her Mary Ann," her mother had said. "Mary Ann," said Flora, "you're going to name a lamp?" "Mary Ann, shepherdess to the lost," said her mother. "Who's lost?" said Flora. But her mother hadn't bothered to answer that question. Flora's got some attitude. "This," Flora said to the squirrel, "is the little shepherdess. Her name is Mary Ann. Unfortunately, she lives here too." Flora doesn't like cute things, I think. I guess unless they're squirrels. The squirrel considered Mary Ann, meaning he looked up close to it. Flora narrowed her eyes and stared at the lamp. She knew it was ridiculous, but sometimes she felt as if Mary Ann knew something she didn't know, that the little shepherdess was keeping some sort of dark and terrible secret. "You stupid lamp," she said. "Mind your own business. Mind your sheep." Actually, there was just one sheep. A tiny lamb curled up at Mary Ann the lamp's pink slippered feet. Flora always wanted to say to the little shepherdess, "If you're such a great shepherdess, where's the rest of your sheep, huh?" "We can just ignore her," said Flora to Ulysses. She turned away from the smug and glowing Mary Ann and climbed the stairs to her room, holding Ulysses gently, carefully in her arms. He didn't glow, but he was surprisingly warm for someone so small. All right, that'll be the end of our read aloud this time. I'll post more chapters soon. Go in and complete your quiz. If you have a short answer question, make sure you write in complete sentences. And we'll discuss the story more at our meeting this week on Friday. Bye, everybody.